Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of the Cachet Conversation series. In this episode, we'll be hearing from Dr. Christhina Candido on high-performance workspace. We hope you enjoy.
This evening I'll be talking about basically a journey that started about 7 years ago now, with this obsession basically around what makes spaces tick. Why should we actually spend time investigating? Why is it relevant for people to understand how the spaces we spend so much time into it actually impact, or does it impact at all? So it started with this curiosity, trying to understand offices in Australia. And back then, and I think this is just as fitting now, it was, all right, so what is really the business case around high-performance workspaces? Why should we bother about that? Is it relevant at all to talk about high-performance workspaces? If that's the case, then why? Well, think about your day. Where were you before coming here? I'm not quite sure. I was actually in my office for most of the day, marking assignments from my 61 students. And then when we look back, we all can relate to these numbers, I think, although I do always find them horrific, like spending 90,000 hours of our working, our life at work. It's quite, sounds wrong, doesn't it? We should be doing something else with this time. But the bottom line is we do spend most of our time indoors, and we do spend most of this time in our office, on our work environment. And it's still very much the case, although we've seen a rise in flexible working arrangement, but we're still very much somewhere doing work, and that is indoors. As a result, we also understood through time that anything that happens within these spaces reflect back on us, either positively or negatively, we don't know. And then there is that, which is like a talent war. So it's not only about, people realize that it's not only about attracting people, but actually keeping the best with you within your business is actually the biggest challenge of all. And then when you look at millennials, this is a lovely report that I actually recommend all of you to have a look at it. This is the 2018 Deloitte results, looking to different generations and what they want at the work. 43% of millennials actually expect to leave the work within 2 years. How is that for churn? And all that lovely knowledge, leaving business with people through, the door. So that's quite horrific. And then when you look at the results a little bit more closely, they actually understood that if there is less flexibility or fewer options in terms of where people work and where they work from, they actually tend to stay less in the workspace or within that particular business. If there is more flexibility available to them, 55% of millennials reported as they actually intend to stay with a business for 5 years or more. Now, that is really important to keep in mind. And then when we look at these big numbers, Australian numbers, for the economy, I could actually fund my research forever and ever if we would just make like a 10% contribution to, let's say, presenteeism, Absenteeism is easier, we can relate to it. It's like you being at work but being sick, or not being at work because you're sick. We lose about 5.1 billions every year in Australia due to illness-related issues, some of which could be actually reduced because of the workspace or the quality of the workspace. But when we look at presenteeism, which is actually much bigger, it's about 5.7 billion a year, we can actually make a significant impact, because if you are at work, the definition of presenteeism is you being at work but not performing at your best. And I see that as our biggest opportunity in Australia, because the workspaces here are, most of it, of very high performance nature. And then there is the whole notion, when you look at the physical configuration and how that has changed over the last 3 decades or so, or even more than that, and the understanding that work is something that you do, it's not a place that you go to. You can actually do and develop your work anywhere. And then when you look at the typical floor plans from where we started, you know, the exodus from private offices all the way to open plan office and whatever that means. And open plan offices, I think we all know they do get a really bad rep. But they change quite dramatically from this cubicle farm all the way to a more open configuration to what people call sometimes or refer to as a club. But fundamentally, offices these days are more into the idea of providing a service to people than actually just a fixed location for people to go and work together. So that's a big change. So about 7 years ago, we started doing research with a tool, when we developed a tool at the University of Sydney and UTS, because we wanted to establish a benchmarking. All right, so if we know, we have anecdotal evidence that Australian offices get, you know, all the accolades that you can think about it, but how do they perform when you compare each other? It was funded by the Australian government and industry partners back in 2011. Now we have about 10,000 occupant survey responses from, you know, maybe some of you, from about 100 offices in Australia. And these offices will typically have any of those certifications. What is really fun from the research perspective is ongoing access to office and people in Australia, and that is a privilege that not many of us actually get to have. And it becomes an ongoing database for research investigation. So it's really interesting and fun for me. And this is some of the results. So when we look at the benchmarking, as we call it, BOSHA, what can we learn from 100 workspaces in Australia? Number 7 is actually the highest possible score, and you know, closer to 1 would be the lowest score. Offices on average will perform well in individual space, thermal comfort, not so much in noise distraction and privacy. This is open plan office. They're notorious for not performing noise distraction and privacy, connection to outdoor environment, and spatial comfort. I'll talk about these things specifically later, but this is how it looks like. What is the good bit about this? We can actually compare as a competition. And we can look into different, this case, I was actually looking to a combi office against a flexi or a private office and see how they actually compare. A lot of flexi offices, hold on, they actually have activity-based working implemented, but they outperform significantly, you know, all the other offices that we had in the database by quite a lot, especially when it comes to spatial comfort. Now, why am I talking about spatial comfort so much? Because that's where designers can have the biggest impact. I heard so many times when I started doing research in this field that it's not about the space. I think it is about the space, just it is about culture, it is about people, and about everything else that you do. Because spatial comfort, all the spaces that we have in the database that do receive very high scores for spatial comfort also have very high scores for productivity and perceived health, which is exactly what we want. And then there was this lovely partnership with Cachet. It started about 2 years ago, and we launched SHE, Sustainable and Healthy Environments. It's a collaboration between several researchers from different backgrounds. So I have people from health science, from architecture, interior design, IT, all trying to get together and understand. Because if I learn anything, I actually see this as a multidisciplinary effort. We need to get together and learn from different disciplines because, you know, trying to provide good spaces for people is a complex thing and a challenging task. So what is the difference with SHE? I'm trying to understand spaces that outperform the rest of the database. We became obsessed over the last 2 years to identify spaces like this one that we are in today. This is one of my top 10 workspaces, and trying to rank them, trying to understand what makes, you know, people tick when they are in these spaces. We have several research streams. It's very much around homocentric design, occupational health, cognitive performance, and we do a lot of research in situ, so have partnership with offices just as important as having, you know, funding to conduct the research, because we need access to people. There was very strong emphasis in activity-based working, which is a very polarizing term. I'm always scared when I'm in industry and I'm say activity-based working because I never know what to expect. But also trying to understand incidental physical activity levels and cognitive performance. What have we learned? Well, when you compare the top 10 workspaces that are from SHE and the BOSSA database, which is the other 100 that I showed before, they actually do a pretty interesting job, and they outperform the other 100 workspaces by quite a lot. If you notice here, spatial comfort is again leading the way, and that really became number one. It comes at number one in our analysis. If you want to actually increase perceived productivity in health, you need to look after the design of the space. That's what the graph actually tells you. Individual space, quite interestingly, doesn't seem to be the biggest issue these days. I think people are getting used to actually getting less or having less at work, or at least we're providing smarter storage. There is a transition happening in Australia. All the other IQ variables will also be outperformed. And then the other thing, connection to outdoor environment, which we have it here in this office. Again, it's something that leads to higher productivity and perceived health levels. So these two things come together. When we look at carefully in activity-based workspaces, these are comparisons between before. So people were occupying an open plan office before, but they had their desk. So it was a fixed location arrangement. Then the blue bar showed results when they moved into a workspace that was designed to support activity-based working. So it's still a very much, open plan office, but of a different kind. I have about 10 workspaces in this analysis, and I think the results speak for themselves. Yeah, I think if it's designed properly, if you actually give people enough support through the space and the infrastructure you're providing, you can achieve very high levels of satisfaction, regardless if people want their own workstation or not, which was quite surprising. Again, it's the same result, but then with the big four, of which we tend to obsess about it. Perceived productivity, sexy word, perceived health, even sexier, over the last 2 years. Overall satisfaction with the work area, overall satisfaction with the building, activity-based working with spaces that support activity-based working or agile, they tend to outperform the other workspaces in this particular analysis. So when we look at the very best out of the 10, WT, which is where you are at the moment, spaces that have WELL certification, which is the highest accolade at the moment in industry, has been the hardest one to get, and then the very, very highest average result. So you can see that if you actually put people, the very center of your design, if you think about who you're designing for, I think it may be like an old thing to do, but it doesn't get old in terms of the results that you can actually achieve. Think about people. It's all what comes down to it. These are the results for WELL certified, the little pink blue bar, and then the blue one is for WT, and then the very highest scores for the entire SHE database. In terms of incidental physical activity or trying to reduce the time that we spend, sitting, so it's not only about moving and increasing your step count every day, which we're all becoming used to do it these days. It's also about moving as much as possible during the day. So it's trying to become less sedentary. What we noticed is if you are in a non-fixed desk arrangement or activity-based working, people tend to move more, although the step count was very similar. So from public health perspective, that is really positive outcome. So what is it that we're trying to do next? Well, I think we need to start setting new benchmarks for the Australian market. I think there is a lot that we've learned from the average performance. There is enough evidence built up, learned a lot over the last 2 years how we can push the boundaries. But then I think the new benchmark will be sitting somewhere in between. But if you're actually talking about high-performance workspaces in Australia, I think we need to do a little bit more around that point. So what are the key takeaways from this? All of these designs that really performed very highly in the database, they were evidence-based. There was an evidence-based approach from the get-go, from when the client started actually the discussions with whoever was doing the design, and they always had this really hard set in getting and building evidence as they went. That is really important. All the top 10 spaces had a really structured change management process or plan. They implemented really serious engagement and ongoing training. So spaces like this that we're here every day, like at the moment, you get briefed from if you're new to the business, then you get, ease into it, the way of working, you're trained, and that is a permanent thing that you do for all the ones that were already here and to the new people that are hired. From design, it's a very human-centered approach. As I said before, it's very strongly aligned with the cultural values of the business, where the business actually wants to go to. And that, if it's that off, then I've never seen any results, positive results actually coming out of any spaces like that. Or if it's fake, if it's actually not authentic to what people are trying to do, again, it doesn't work because people can see it through. You have a variety of zones that are created to support different activities, and the design is really done to the point there is a lot of care that goes into it. Each space is thought through of flexibility in different activities that will be happening there. And it's the first time in the history of open plan offices that you're actually implementing freedom again. Because if people can actually move around, if you are in a zone that is noisy, or if it is in a zone that is quite hot, you don't really need to be attached to a desk anymore. You can actually change, and you can go elsewhere. Or if there is a colleague that is quite loud, if there is a Brazilian making noise around you, like me, then you can always move. You're not attached to a desk. And what I find fascinating is that people are actually embracing that as a positive. So yes, you're losing your workstation, which is the last thing that you would own in an open plan office, but you're actually gaining the entire office footprint back. And I think that understanding, with of course the advancing technology that wasn't really in the market a couple of years ago when this started in Australia, that's really pushing things towards a positive outcome. But everything else that I said before needs to be there as well. This is the recipe. Key features that I've identified through site visits and floor plan analysis of the physical environment. Active design features are always implemented. Sit and stand workstations, end-of-trip facilities, breakout spaces, mobility, flexibility, biophilic design, natural textures, and access to daylight. All the 10 offices, all of them had all of these features implemented to different levels, different interpretations, but they were all there. Thank you.
So we'll invite the other panel members up now, Sarah, Nick and Anthony. So just to give you a brief introduction to these people. Nick Deeks is the Managing Director of WT Partnership in Australia and New Zealand and Joint Chairman of WT International. Nick has 35 years experience in the property and construction industries, 13 in the UK and 22 of which are in Australia. Anthony George, who's an associate at WT Partnership, is a leading professional in the workplace fit-out industry across Australia, working with Phil Anseline and his team. Clients Anthony has proudly worked for include AMP, Allianz, NAB, CBA, Suncorp, Atlassian, Arup Minter and Norton Rose. I think I got them all. Yeah.
That's just this month.
Yeah, that's just this month, is it? And then Sarah Dickens is a Group Design Associate at Cachet, helping drive optimise design outcomes for our clients with our team. She's over 20 years experience designing through the UK and Australia, some of our best and biggest facilities. So please welcome these people. So Nick, let's start with you.
Hang on, it's on.
You're on.
Oh. Got to push a button. Okay.
Let's start with you. And before we dive into the questions, as MD of WD Partnership, could you maybe give some context around the journey that you took to a high-performance workspace?
Yeah, that was an interesting journey. It probably started in 2013. When I became managing director, we had a major structural change inside the business, and there was a completely different way of thinking. We were thinking more about the future and more about people than the next 5 minutes in our own back pockets. And we started to get a plan about what we wanted the business to be, how we wanted it to be, how we wanted to leave it when we departed the business. We were thinking about strategy and future planning, thinking about our current workspace. We were over in North Point. We'd been in North City for 52 years. We'd been in North Point building for 36 years. Everybody had offices. All the directors had offices. That was all around the perimeter. Typical old school type of thing. Everyone worked in little cubicles. There was a breakout space that was in the middle of the office that didn't have any natural light, didn't have any windows. And you know, you look back on it now and you can't believe that we actually spent time in there and lived in there and worked in that kind of space. And then through a series of circumstances, I managed to meet Rowan. And we went out and had a little chat. And the briefing, this is actually quite a strange story. This just shows how good this guy is. This is the briefing for this space. We were walking around the Australian Open. And it was a beautiful day. We were watching Rory McIlroy, and the American guy won it in the end, didn't he? But we were sitting on the 18th having a couple of beers, and I said, I'm not going to write anything down about what I want or what we want. I don't want it to be too prescriptive. It's about a feeling. And I don't want it to feel like an office. And I want it to be something completely different. I want it to be multi-purpose. I want it to be multifunctional, and just be cognizant of us, where we are, how we're trying to change our business, and what we're going to be in the future. So you call that a brief. Somehow he turned that from that to this. So that was the start of that journey. Then that took about a year and a half, I suppose, between discussing it, thinking about it, and it actually coming to life. It was a massive change for all of us, and we had changed situations of people had only ever worked in North Sydney, so they didn't want to come to the city. They didn't want to leave where they were. They didn't want an office bigger than what it was. They didn't want to take on a bigger space that cost more rent. They didn't want to look at the risk involved of taking a 10-year lease. So I'd mapped out, I put a map of Sydney, and I put a pin on where every member of staff lived on the map to make sure that we weren't disenfranchising too many people if we were going to move over to the city. And it was about 50-50, so that didn't disturb me too much. And then we had to set about a change management process and a conversation, really, to bring people along the way. Because as much as you might think, why wouldn't anyone want to come into this space, going from a fixed, stuffy old office with an average of 12 metres of paper per person, which is what we had, to this kind of space. But people don't know what they don't know. So you've got to be able to educate them to what the potential is. And you know, Ant was instrumental in that, Gary was instrumental in it, and obviously the guys from Cachet were. And we had a thought wall in our breakout space at the time. Any idea, no idea was a bad idea. I don't even know if there were any ideas up there, were they, when we started? There was nothing. So we actually had to try and, you know, guide people along and help them. There was a lot of sort of resistance to it all. So bringing people along and that whole change management and conversation of what it could possibly be when people have been in a kind of stifled environment for many years and not been given that opportunity to think about what they could have and what they, you know, potentially could be provided, and were there any hooks, and was there something we were doing just to, you know, stop giving them a pay rise or you know, cancel their bonus or something. So that's kind of how it started, and you know, there's a lot in between there and where we got to now. But
And you obviously saw Christina's presentation, and you've got a space now that's high performing. What has that meant for your business and its bottom line?
Well, I mean, whether we've been fortunate, one, in picking this space, completely lucky that we had Cachet that knew what they were doing when we probably didn't know too much about what we were doing, and we ended up with this space, and you know, the market, current market situation. But in 2015, we put a 5-year strategic plan together, which draft of that is up on the wall over there. And in that 5-year plan, we were forecasting a 28% increase in revenue, 30% increase in profit, and 33% increase in headcount. From this office alone, we were 74 people when we left. We're now 128 people. In the middle of early 2018, our 5-year plan was done. So we were roughly 30% increase in headcount, profitability, and revenue. We're 50% increase in headcount, revenue, and profitability. And if you take on our overseas operations, we're close to 75 to 80% uplift in all 3 of those things. So it's been pretty good, actually.
And what other indicators are you taking, I suppose, from your business, which you could, I suppose, attribute to the physical presence of the workspace?
The benefits of it, other benefits apart from financial. I mean, it's a great place. It's a great place to work. Well, it's actually a recognised great place to work. It is actually a great place to work. But the attrition rate is down. The attraction rate is up. When we set about trying to employ people when we were in 74 people over the road, it was just impossible. We could never get uni students to come in as grads. We've probably used recruiters for maybe 10 of those 60 odd positions that we've had in the last year and a half. We've had a little bit of attrition. Maybe as we moved across, there might have been 4 that just couldn't cope with the new concept. So I think attitude, productivity, efficiency, general health and well-being, communication between staff, everybody knows each other now. And as odd as that might seem in a normal office, people don't know each other, but they know each other here. We encourage people to walk around. We encourage people to spend time when they're going to get a coffee, to actually stay there and get a coffee. It's not about cracking a whip and saying, get back to your desk. If you're not at your desk, you're not working. It's not about that. It's like that whole thing of Margaret Heffernan does on social capital. You know, we have Pilates in here on a Thursday afternoon. We have social groups. We have fitness stuff. We have, you know, events like this all the time. So the collaboration within our staff and the collaboration and openness with our clients and just the general community is lifting the profile of the business. It's about giving something back. We work with the universities. We try and help the universities out. So we started to conduct lectures inside the uni. From the first year that we did that, 12 of the students who came into the class of 150, and bearing in mind they've been told at uni, you know, quantity surveying, and everyone's got a perception of quantity surveying, 12 of them wanted a job. So we've now got an ongoing program for cadets, for grads, and you know, just it all just starts to build on itself. I can't even put a finger on which one of those things gets the ball rolling, but it all starts the ball rolling. And it's a bit like Christhina said about coming from a good place and from an honest place. Most of those things were not done for gain. It was done to be able to give something back, and like just to be able to take a little step back and say, let's actually approach unis. Let's go to the schools. Let's start giving some of our time. Let's start telling and educating about the profession. And I think if you do the right thing, good things come back to you. So.
And you were pretty instrumental in this fit out, obviously, but also you're pretty instrumental in the fit out industry generally through Australia. What observations can you share with what people are looking for in the market for high performance workspace?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest change we've certainly had technology, which is constant change. We've had ESD and health flexibility. But the biggest change I think has been the shift from static to ABW and now to agile. So we've gone from activity-based working with a multitude of settings to support different styles of work to now the concept of agile methodologies. And what that means for major corporate tenants is quite different. So we're talking about language like tribes now and Scrum Masters and agile that's scalable into management levels as well. That's probably been the biggest change, because what that means for workplace design, what we see that means is that business leaders are looking to remove all the friction points that their staff have while they're performing their work, their job. So we've seen that start in the tech industry. We've now seen it move into finance, accounting, even into the legal profession. So yeah, I think that just taking away the friction that exists for people to work in their teams and perform their jobs is what we're seeing the biggest change.
Sarah, what are you seeing in you've had a long career obviously, but how do you see design playing a role in high performance workspace?
Obviously customization is really key, like actually finding out individuals' work styles and designing to that. But the biggest thing that I'm seeing, and I think in the future as well, is obviously the idea of a company's culture and fostering that. So design really needs to be focused on the company's culture and being able to create spaces similar to what we've got at WT. We're also seeing at places like Google in San Francisco, where food is really a key driver of getting people together, and it's all about celebrating culture within the business. Because without good culture, we're not able to have a nice place to work, essentially. And I think that's why people come into work now, because we've got that flexibility is to have good culture.
Christhina, you've done some really world-class research with this stuff you've been doing. What's your opinion on how the research will help define optimum work environments into the future, and how does design play a part in that?
I think it's building the evidence about what actually works. I think that's what motivates me. It's not about, just talking about open plan offices and acoustic related issues if you can't actually point to solutions. So is actually putting things into context and looking at the physical configuration of the space, trying to understand where the issues are coming from, but actually building a narrative around positive. Yeah, can we actually have positive stories from open plan offices? Yes, I have like quite a few of them already, and it has been only 2 years. So I think that is definitely where we should be looking to, is actually finding solutions and stop whinging about things that don't work, if I can put it that way. I'm an academic, I get to say these things. Because if anything, is irresponsible not to. Yeah? If you look at what is happening in Australia in the uptake of agile methodology, activity-based working, whatever is happening, it's not going away the same way that open plan office hasn't gone away. And yes, I agree with you that we're seeing all the sectors, moving towards the same direction. And in some cases, for example, in academia, it'll be actually a two-hop. Yeah, we're still very much in a private setting, and we're moving into activity-based working in some cases. So I think building the evidence, identifying things that work, and putting the narrative out there is it's actually what we need to do.
And you're involved in the initial search kind of criteria sometimes through office space. What are the top items that organisations look for when they're trying to complete a high-performance workspace?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question in the Sydney market at the moment, because we're always hearing about how short the supply is of good office space. And now the things that I think the market leaders were doing, the whole industry wants to replicate. So there's almost a base expectation for things like end-of-trip facilities, natural daylight, a side core to allow a good open plan floor plate. Connectivity now for larger tenants between floors is a given, something they just expect the developer or the landlord to provide in terms of voids and internal stairs, that sort of thing. But it's certainly also very unique depending on who that occupier is. So working with the technology sector, they're looking for a specific feel to their space that's a bit more collegiate. And then working with a kind of tier 1 law firm, they're looking for that kind of blue chip presence in the big end of town. But I think the qualities that Christhina alluded to around the space itself are becoming par for the course. So well rating in the base building, as I say, end of trip, just those general health and ESD components are an expectation. and then tenants might look to push beyond that. But yeah.
Nick, you're obviously a tenant, and when you were doing your initial search, you would go from probably what I would call a low-performing workspace to a high-performing workspace. What challenges did you find when you were initially searching? And when you set out on your journey, were the perceived challenges that you had, were they actually the challenges that you lived out?
I think one of the things that was a bit of a stumbling block for us, I mentioned it earlier on about part of the resistance. So some of the directors and shareholders didn't want to be looking at an increased annual expenditure. So we had to try and justify why we thought we should be taking on an extra 300 square metres of space, and the fact that we could grow from 74 to 100. That was our plan, to get to 100. Was just understanding the amount of space that we needed, really. So we were kind of stuck with, okay, we might be able to get to 100. Do you think we can get to 100? Can we back ourselves to get to 100 people? So how much space do we need for 100 people? Let's say that's 13 square metres. So we need 130 square metres, 1,300 square metres. Now, that was just a weird perception, and maybe that was just, kind of ignorance and looking at it a bit at a high level. But that's not the way to be looking at it now. And I would have a completely different view about how I would look at some new space if we were to move. And certainly over the next 5 years, I think the utilisation of office space is going to be a very different prospect to how it is now. So we were quite stuck on health and wellness, needed to be close to transportation, needed to have good end-of-trip facilities, because I wanted to encourage people not to be driving to work. So it needed to be somewhere that everyone could start walking and get a bit more healthy. So if we're going to be doing that, we have to have good end-of-trip facilities to be able to do that. And I even sold my car in the process, but I didn't realise until once we'd actually signed the lease and checked with Phil as the finance director, and said, how many spaces car park spaces did we end up with? He said, exactly the same as we had in Northport, -1 for the one that you don't need. Like, oh, good on you. Right, so that worked well, didn't it? Anyway, that's fine, because I didn't need it, and I walk and do everything. And I think a lot of people walk and move around far more and are far more active as a result. So what we were really looking for was good services, good lifting, good light, and it had to just feel right. I think I walked into a few spaces with you where I'd come out the lift lobby and just go, nah, no good for us. Don't like the feel of it. Either the ceiling felt too low, or there wasn't enough light, or we only had light on two elevations instead of, this one, which is actually a very fortunate building. I was chatting to Tom earlier on. You would walk past 45 Clarence Street every day of the week, and when it came up on our search criteria, it was like, where's 45 Clarence Street? Anyway, we came over because it was the wrong end of town. Like when we were looking at this, Barangaroo wasn't there. Everyone was further down that end of the city. Anyway, we came and had a look and walked in. I mean, you can picture it at the time. It had a tiled ceiling and it had white plastic on the floor, and everything was completely open. But as you walk around, you've got such an interesting view and different concept from every single elevation that it was kind of a no-brainer, and we thought we'd just landed on a jewel in the crown there. So that was quite fortunate. It was a bit of a struggle. It is a bit of a struggle to find a space. And you just, it's like, what are the drivers? You're hampered by cost, you're hampered by the lease term that you're prepared to take on board, the size of space that you think you need for the number of people that you think you've got or can grow to or are going to reduce to. So it's a complicated thing, and whether it was good judgment or just plain luck, we ended up in here.
Bit of both, maybe.
Very grateful for it. Yeah.
Christhina, are you seeing any correlations from what Nick's talking about in your research?
Yeah, I think he did hit quite a few of the keywords that I presented, like this willingness to actually put the occupant into the center of the decision making. I think one of the things that really resonated with me the first time I visited this office was all the meeting rooms are actually on the less privileged spot in the entire office, and you give back the best views and the best access to daylight to the workers. I mean, how revolutionary is that in a way? Because in many offices you actually see the opposite. You see the meeting rooms because you want to impress clients. You see the meeting rooms with the best view. So I think this whole idea that was around the values that they were actually targeting, it was about fundamentally changing the way that they wanted to work, the way they were seeing themselves as a business, who they were trying to attract and keep. And then, of course, the physical features of the spaces, of feeling right. It's quite interesting listening to you reporting that way, because when I go through the open-ended comments, these are things that do come up quite often. Like, my office doesn't have access to a view or, to daylight or anything that is actually interesting. And that was clearly placed in the center of the decision-making here. And I have 100%, I'm sure that really justifies the success story that it is this office particularly. Yeah.
Sarah, what would you say to Christina's comments, and what do they mean for design in the future?
Wow. I would completely agree with Christina's comments. I also think she really touched on the biophilic design principles. Daylight's really important, natural materials, air and temperature. I also think customisation of your work style and space during the day are also important. But I tend to agree with everything that has been said this evening.
And Ant, for you, how can a business successfully manage that change if they're adopting potentially a new work style in a new high-performance environment?
Well, that's actually usually the key driver. So you're talking about a business that's been in the same location for 10 years plus, and it's just the way they work, the style of working is outdated. So you're not just talking about a new space and what that means in terms of the design and the look and feel and the location. You're actually talking about for your employees when they arrive and when they leave, and everything in between is new as well. So I know change management was spoken about by Christhina and also by Nick, and that's very important. And certainly from our side, the cost side, it's interesting to see the direct correlation between companies that are prepared to invest in that process, and even with things like pilot spaces and cycling employees through an actual replica of what the new space will be and the new work style. And then companies that maybe don't invest as much or don't invest at all, you can definitely measure that result after they move in.
Nick, you're obviously big on embracing change before it embraces you. So I suppose now that you've got a high-performing workspace, what do you think needs to change or evolve for WT to kind of keep it at that level?
There's a couple of things that we're looking at there. From a personal perspective, I try and do the little test and dummy runs on myself before I flick it onto the rest of the business. So I'm currently analysing my sleep patterns and my sleep readiness every day and my work readiness every day. So if we can get to see how people perform, because not everyone's like ready to work at 8 o'clock, and they don't do their best from 8 o'clock till 6 o'clock. It's kind of crazy concept to me that everyone needs to come to work at the same time and everyone needs to go home at the same time. So if we can understand when people are at their optimum performance, and that may be, and you can only do that once you've started to come into an open and agile, flexible working environment. If people had better come in, they're firing at 11 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock, then they should come in at 11 o'clock. So I want to be able to get the business to shift into understanding when everyone's optimum performance is, and then we'll run our business around that. And then the ultimate aim in that is that we've got to a 6-hour working day instead of an 8-hour working day. And everyone still gets paid for an 8-hour working day, but we're going to be much more higher performing. So that's one thing from a personnel perspective. From an IT and intelligence perspective, we've set up an Innovation Excellence Committee across the country, and we're looking at innovating our business and how we can take the next step on. So we went from paperless to paper, we've gone from phones to unified communications and no phones, all of which is important to be able to have a flexible, no permanent seating arrangement. And we're now looking at AI and machine learning and how we can incorporate some of that into our business to take us through to the next step that we're ahead of anyone else that's competing in our space. And we're constantly looking ahead and making sure the business is resilient and going to last for, you know, the next generation beyond me. So,
And to go back, I suppose, in time, what things did you learn through the process to a high-performance workspace, and what might you do differently next time?
well, that's pretty good that you've asked that, because we've rolled out this type of workspace in Sydney, Perth, Adelaide, Canberra, and Brisbane is our latest one. They moved in September. This, as I said earlier, took about a year and a half of communication and conversation and education and learning and holding people's hands and just bringing them along, and, you know, the ones who are just flatly refusing, just keep coaxing them along. So that took a little while to get the Sydney office and the Sydney business around their minds around what it should be, what it could be, and how it is that it works. We've subsequently rolled that out in every one of the other offices across Australia. Melbourne's having a little refit over Christmas. And the process has been kind of the same, that there's been resistance and people don't want to do it, they don't want to change, but it's got less and less and less. And the Brisbane office, I think, is a culmination of that. The change management process was far less. The fit out took about 10 weeks, and it finished a couple of weeks early, and everyone moved in and they loved it. And we've tweaked a few things along the way, but not a lot. I mean, if you were going to say, what would I change in here? There's not a lot of things that I would change. I mean, I think you guys got it pretty spot on when you did it, and 2.5 years on, you know, our concept was always that we had kind of sheets of wallpaper that we could just pull down and redress the place every few years. And I don't think we've got to the point of having to do that yet. One of the major things, I think, is that we did not anticipate being able to get to 120, 130 people within this space. So base building facilities are not sufficient for the amount of people that are in there. So I think I'd take that on board next time around with a little bit more foresight into what we think we could get, and does that base building even provide sufficient services? Because the building occupation is very different to how it was 5 years ago. So the way that they design electrical, the way they design the air conditioning and the litres per second of fresh air, and the zoning is just different. You've got more people in a smaller space.
Might have to build you a balcony out here. Open-ended balcony to fit them all.
And we need a drone platform out there. That's what we need.
Christina, you've heard from people on the coalface obviously today and their considerations. What areas of research interest you moving forward from what these guys have said?
I think really excited about ideas around reconfigurable, flexible fit outs. How far can we push this? When you start thinking about, you know, the way people work now, co-working, but also leases being reduced. I don't know, it was 10 years, then 5 years. You know, some business tell me that is like 2 years. So actually getting to a flat pack sort of fit out, almost very close to it. And then, of course, the whole manufacturing side of that comes with all sorts of interesting research questions in itself, because if you're just going to pack and move, or if you can actually allow people to reconfigure the office fit out during the day-to-day activities, then you can actually really allow for that maximum level of flexibility that we're not quite there yet. So I think I see that as the next like transformative thing happening. It's already happening in Australia, and I'm just really interested to see where we're going to end up with this idea. Yeah.
Fantastic. We might throw it to you guys out in the audience. We've got 2 questions that we can take for the panel members. We have a mic, so throw your hands up if you have a question. Manesh? Oh, hang on.
Hi.
David.
Hi. Obviously tonight we've been talking about interior design and office interiors. One of the things I'm interested in, particularly in Australia compared to say some other countries, are the developers and the base buildings they're designing, and how have they really understand what a good interior office requires. And because I still feel in Australia, architects design the building to how it looks from the outside and not how it performs on the inside. I'm just wondering, how do we sort of work with the developers to improve efficiencies of buildings so they work better from an interiors standpoint?
Would you like to hear from anyone in particular?
Anyone?
Well, we sort of see that pretty much every day. There seems to be a real discord, hopefully there's no developers in the room, but there seems to be a real discord between what developers are prepared to provide in the base building, knowing full well the way that occupiers are going with their workspace. So whether that's shorter lease terms, or whether that's even lease terms that are on consumption, or whether that's providing spaces outside of a tenancy that those tenants can still use, so that they can better use their own space. But even beyond that, talking about, to your point, Nick, engineering services, fresh air, air conditioning, internal stairs and connectivity. It seems like what we've seen in the last few years has also been a shift towards larger and larger incentives that are enticing tenants into buildings, but buildings that you could really say are underperforming. And most of that incentive money goes back into up-speccing the base building.
Well, it's even just getting the base build stair in. You end up putting your money into that rather than it going into the customisation of the air units and that sort of thing. It's it's a difficult one, and I think we need to start expecting more from the developers actually, because they're very behind on the times when it comes to spaces.
One of the aspects, I'll just add in a little bit there. We're actually writing a reverse brief for a commercial building over in North Sydney around innovation and what should the developers be doing. So it's actually a very apt question you've just asked there. With air conditioning, so air conditioning's there as a base build load to supply during the day. During the evening, it's an out of hours, flick a switch and pay an additional cost and a premium, whatever. I think buildings are going to be going to a 24-hour occupation. So we need to be able to look at various different tenants within the one occupancy. There's no reason why we can't have this space tenanted during the night from a different company. As your IT systems improve and everything becomes cloud-based, you've taken all your hardware off-site, someone should be able to come in. I actually commented on this a few months ago, and I started getting inquiries about renting our space overnight. And I'd only thrown it out there as just a little poke just to see what was happening. But I think that's where it's going to go. And I could see this space, if we stayed here in 5 years' time, we'd have the same number of people or more in half of this space. So then this one space would have 4 tenants, half there, and then the same happening overnight. And that's where I think developers need to be thinking about things. It's not just a work day 7 till 7 or 12 hours of occupation. What happens during that night shift? And that's not, it's developers, but we've got to be able to think about cities, movement around cities, smart cities. Everyone comes to work at the same time. We're all impacting on traffic and congestion and pollution. If we can start spreading that thing out, that's just a bit of a mind shift, but then that's a global connectivity of workspaces and be able to work with your overseas operations in a 24-hour business productivity. I think that's where we're going to be going for society.
Yeah, are we saying that we need to get occupants, mechanical engineers and architects collaborating a little bit more?
With developers, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But you need to have it on the right scale, because to your point, David, if you have a large enough business, you'll be able to have some leverage with a developer or a landlord. But if you have a single floor tenancy like this, you don't have that same leverage. So we need to have it be across different size tenancies as well.
It's quite challenging in the sense that base building, it's quite aesthetic. It's there, it's basic infrastructure. The building's built for however, 3 decades or how long it's going to be there. But fit outs are dramatically changing. And they change, frequently because you have different tenants moving into, which was different from last decade. And they change because, from time to time, you already build into your business that from time to time you're going to have to refresh. I just keep, hearing this fit out refreshment, whatever that means. So how do you actually bring this? It's a spatial and temporal issue, because by the time the air conditioning in this building was implemented, had a completely different logic in terms of how it was sized. You have double the size of, of the population for this particular fit out. I'm not going to be surprised if it's the same for all the floors. But you also have the controlling operations is still very much aesthetic. So what I would hope to see is big jumps. Yeah, I think we can actually, if you think in terms of not trying to bring more the flexibility that we want and we're after in terms of the fit out along with the base building, but actually have more flexibility on the operational side as well, because Nick is right in saying that we're just going to see through flexibility getting people working not longer hours but shorter hours, but working when they're actually doing their work best. That does make a lot more sense to me. So if you actually, you know, I'm only awake around 10, so why do I need to be lecturing at 8? It's wrong. So I think we'll see more demands on the base building and the operational to implement more flexibility and to try to follow and cater these flexible tenanted spaces. That's what I would hope, I think.
We've got time for one more question.
Hearing you talking about all this makes me wonder about there's a lot of stuff that is kind of outside your core competency. You have to build a lot of knowledge on the inside to not only manage the space, but keep it performing at this really high level. And if you're talking about the multi-tenants overnight, now you're starting to become a landlord. There's another competency that you need to build. Is there an attraction for you to go to like office space as a service, and what would that make an interest for you?
I guess that was aimed at me, was it, that one? Most of what I do is outside of my core competency, so I'm quite comfortable with that. I don't know if that's where it went. Then I don't necessarily see it as say we would be the main lease, the head leaseholder, and we would sublease it. There needs to be some flexibility in the whole lease term. That's how it could be. So, I clearly haven't thought it through that much. I just chucked it out there to see see what kind of reaction I'd get back on LinkedIn. But if that's where it went, I mean, our business is a very different business to what it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago, and it will be very different again in 5 years' time. We might be app developers, we might own cybersecurity companies. The fact that we started off doing quantity surveying doesn't mean we have to do quantity surveying forevermore. So I'll never say never.
So there's an attraction for you to go to an office as a service model, to really just outsource the whole thing, and then have more choice. As a big portfolio, somebody else is managing it for you. You are able to scale up and down more easily, choose different locations. You can move easily. I'm asking that because there's a big increase of these co-working spaces that are becoming less co-working, but more an office as a service as a target for a particular tenant.
Yeah. So all our US offices are in co-location workspaces now, and that's purely to enable us to scale up and scale down, or move if we need to have a project in San Francisco and we've picked up a new major project in San Francisco. We need to have an office. It's easy enough for us to go and get a co-location workspace. So that business has only been going for 2.5 years, and to try and commit to long-term leases for a startup business, it's not very palatable. Whereas these co-lo spaces, co-workspaces, are far easier to be able to work with and deal with and adapt. And from us, that's not necessarily that we're sitting there working with some geniuses that are going to help collaborate with us. It's just to enable us to have flexibility and be in control of the cost and our capacity to scale up or scale down. So I just think that there's going to be a huge shift in the office space and the interior space over the next few years.
What do you see, Ant, being in the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we do a lot of work with WeWork and also with Hub Australia, and some of their biggest occupiers are actually major corporates. I think Microsoft occupy a huge number of desks with WeWork globally for that exact flexibility. What we've also seen though is there's a tipping point in the model where as a startup business moving into a sort of a scale up, you get to the point where it's no longer cost effective to lease all those desks, and it makes more sense to take a short-term lease. So if we can get that model right, you'd have to think similarly to Uber with taxis and Airbnb with hotels, that that's the next industry for disruption.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for, guys. Please thank our panel members, Christhina and Sarah and Nick. And thank you for coming tonight. That concludes the formality for the evening. Please stay and join us for a beverage or some more food. If you'd like to follow the Cachet Conversation series, please follow the Cachet page on LinkedIn. Thank you.